A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at the recent figures on first-time homebuyers this morning, and it is starting to feel like the three-bedroom house has become the most effective form of birth control ever invented. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the postponement trend we are seeing across the globe, specifically looking at the average age of first-time home ownership versus the average age of first-time parenthood, and how those two lines are finally colliding in the March 2026 data.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Daniel has really tapped into a massive shift in the social fabric with this one. What I find wild is that for decades, we treated these as two separate economic tracks. But the research coming out of the University of Toronto this month basically proves they are the same track. If you cannot park the car in a driveway you own, you are significantly less likely to put a car seat in the back of it. We are seeing a causal link now, not just a correlation.
It is a bottleneck, plain and simple. We have moved from a society where you got married and bought a house in your early 20s to a world where people are pushing 40 before they get the keys to their first place. I want to look at the global landscape first because the numbers are staggering. Herman, you were digging into the Swiss and Japanese data earlier. How late are we actually talking here?
It varies wildly by geography, but the trend line is identical everywhere. In Switzerland, we are seeing the oldest first-time buyers in the world at a median age of 48. Japan is pushing 40. Here in the United States, the National Association of Realtors just released their record-high median age of 40 for first-time buyers. Compare that to the 1980s, when that number was consistently in the late 20s. We have essentially added a full decade of waiting to the standard life cycle.
And that decade is the prime window for starting a family. That is the core of the issue. When you look at the parenthood side, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, shows the average age for first-time motherhood has climbed from 28.5 in the year 2000 to nearly 31 today. In South Korea, it is 33. When your first home and your first child are both arriving in your mid to late 30s, you are not just postponing life stages, you are truncating them. You simply run out of time for a second or third child.
The biological clock and the amortization schedule are in direct conflict. But there is a really interesting debate happening right now regarding how old these buyers actually are. We are seeing a bit of a data war between the major real estate players. The National Association of Realtors, or NAR, is sticking to that age 40 figure, but Redfin recently challenged this using credit report data and placed the age closer to 35.
That is a 5-year gap. Why is the data so bifurcated? Is it just a matter of who they are polling, or is there something deeper in how we define a first-time buyer?
It is a methodology split. Jessica Lautz, the deputy chief economist at the NAR, relies heavily on mail-in surveys, which tends to capture older, more established households who have the time and inclination to fill them out. Chen Zhao, the head of economics at Redfin, is looking at actual loan applications and credit pulls. But there is a hidden variable that explains why the age is not even higher despite prices skyrocketing, and that is what economists are calling the bank of mom and dad.
Right, the intergenerational wealth transfer. If you have parents who can cut a check for $100,000 for a down payment, you can buy at 31. If you are doing it on your own, you are waiting until 45. It is creating a two-tiered class of adulthood where your ability to start a family is increasingly tied to your parents' home equity, rather than your own salary.
The Redfin data suggests that first-time buyers are actually getting slightly younger in certain markets, but only because the percentage of buyers receiving family help has doubled in the last 5 years. It is an artificial suppression of the age. If we removed parental gifts from the equation, the median age in the United States would likely be closer to 45 in major coastal cities. Look at Vancouver as an outlier. The average age for a first-time buyer there has exploded to 46. In Ontario, it is 40. The national average across Canada is 36. We are seeing a massive divergence based on who has access to family capital.
This brings us to the research Daniel mentioned in the prompt. Benjamin K. Couillard, spelled Couillaard, but pronounced Couillard, published a landmark paper at the University of Toronto just a few weeks ago, on March 3rd. He looks specifically at the bedroom bottleneck. Herman, his findings on 3-bedroom units versus studios were pretty damning for current urban planning models.
The Couillard study is the smoking gun for the link between housing and fertility. He found that the lack of 3-bedroom housing acts as a physical barrier to birth rates. Specifically, providing family-sized units in a given area increases the birth rate 2.3 times more than building the same number of units as studios or 1-bedroom apartments. Most of our high-density development over the last decade has been micro-units and 1-bedrooms. We are building cities that are physically incapable of housing children.
It is the ultimate birth control. You can have all the tax credits and pro-natalist rhetoric you want, but if the only available housing in a commutable distance to jobs is a 500 square foot box, people are going to stop at 1 kid or 0 kids. Couillard basically proved that you cannot build your way out of a fertility crisis by just building more units. You have to build the right kind of units. If you build 10,000 studios, you get 0 additional babies. If you build 10,000 3-bedroom townhomes, the demographic needle actually moves.
The mechanism is straightforward. A couple might feel comfortable having a baby in a 1-bedroom apartment for a year or 2. But once that child starts walking and you start thinking about a second child, the lack of a 3rd bedroom becomes an insurmountable wall. If the next step up is a 3-bedroom house that costs twice as much, the couple simply opts out of the second child. This is why we saw the United States total fertility rate drop to a record low of 1.62 in 2025.
I suspect this is why we are seeing such a pivot in legislation lately. The United States Senate passed the 21st Century Road to Housing Act on March 13th. It is a massive swing at the supply side, but it also takes a shot at institutional investors. And President Trump signed those 2 executive orders aimed at cutting the red tape for builders and helping community banks streamline mortgages. It feels like a realization that the housing market is not just an economic issue anymore, it is a demographic survival issue.
The focus on community banks is key there. Large institutional lenders are great at processing cookie-cutter loans for suburbs, but community banks are often the ones funding the smaller, multi-bedroom developments in middle-tier cities. By reducing the regulatory burden on those smaller banks, the goal is to get more diverse housing types on the market. We have spent 20 years over-regulating the very institutions that could solve the bedroom bottleneck.
Let's talk about the lending side of this postponement trend, because it is creating a new problem that I've been hearing called the 30-year trap. If you are buying your first home at 40 or 45, a standard 30-year mortgage takes you well past the typical retirement age. I know this is becoming a huge flashpoint in the United Kingdom and Australia right now.
It is a massive hurdle. In Australia, the average age for a first-time buyer is now 37, up from 30 in the early 2000s. If you apply for a 30-year loan at 37, you are 67 when it finishes. That is exactly when the government expects you to retire. Lenders are becoming increasingly wary of mature first-time buyers because they worry about the income cliff at retirement. They are starting to apply much stricter lending criteria to anyone over 40.
So if you wait too long to save for a down payment, the bank decides you are too old to pay it back. It is a pincer movement. You cannot afford to buy when you are young, and you are not allowed to borrow when you are old. In the United Kingdom, only 6% of first-time buyers are now under the age of 25. The Skipton Group just reported on March 19th that the average age there has hit 34. That is 5 years older than it was in the 90s.
And that is why we saw the Australian government expand their Help to Buy scheme and the 5% deposit guarantee. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS, reported a 6.8% jump in first home buyer loans late last year because the government essentially stepped in to bridge that gap. Without government intervention, the 30-year trap would effectively end home ownership for anyone who has not secured a mortgage by age 40.
It changes the whole economic profile of a person's life. If you are a mid-career buyer, You are not spending money on the things 25-year-olds spend money on. You are not buying entry-level furniture or doing DIY renovations in the same way. You are already in your peak earning years, but a massive chunk of your income is now being diverted into a mortgage that you will be paying off until you are 70. The second-order effect on consumer spending is going to be fascinating to watch over the next decade.
What concerns me is the loss of the wealth-building phase. Traditionally, you bought at 25, paid it off by 55, and then had 10 to 15 years of zero housing costs to supercharge your retirement savings. If you are paying that mortgage until 70, you never get that high-velocity savings window. You are essentially working until the day you die just to stay in the house. This creates a massive drag on the economy because that older demographic has zero discretionary income.
It also impacts the ability of that generation to help their own children, which breaks the bank of mom and dad cycle we talked about earlier. If the current 40-year-old buyers are still paying their own mortgages when their kids turn 30, they won't have the equity to help them buy. We are looking at a potential systemic collapse of the current home ownership model within 1 or 2 generations. We are eating our own tail here.
This is where I think we might see the rise of the multi-generational mortgage. We have seen these in places like Japan where the loan term can be 50 or 60 years and it is legally passed down to the children. It sounds dystopian to some, but if property values continue to outpace wages at this rate, it might be the only way to keep the dream of ownership alive. It turns a home from an individual asset into a family legacy debt.
That feels like a return to a more feudal structure, where the debt is tied to the lineage rather than the individual. But when you look at the fertility numbers, the implications are even darker. If people are waiting until 35 to buy a house and 33 to have a first child, and they are doing that in an environment of high debt, the chance of them having a second child is almost zero. We are effectively choosing a society of renters with no children over a society of owners with families.
The South Korean example is the ultimate warning sign. They have a fertility rate of 0.7. That is well below replacement level. Their first-time motherhood age is the highest in the world at 33. They have high-density housing, but it is almost entirely small apartments that do not support family life. They are essentially a laboratory for what happens when the postponement trend reaches its logical conclusion. They have the housing, but they do not have the bedrooms.
It is a total demographic collapse, and it is not just an East Asian problem. Italy, Spain, and Greece are all seeing first-time motherhood ages over 32. These are countries with high unemployment for young people and very rigid housing markets. The link Daniel is asking about is not just a correlation, it is a feedback loop. High housing costs lead to late parenthood, which leads to fewer children, which eventually leads to a shrinking workforce and a stagnant economy, which makes housing even harder to afford for the next generation.
One thing I want to circle back to is the United States legislative response. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act is trying to limit institutional investor purchases. The idea is that if Wall Street firms are not outbidding families for 3-bedroom suburban homes, the price might stabilize. There is a lot of debate on how much of an impact institutional buyers actually have, but politically, it is a very popular move. People want to feel like they are competing against other families, not against a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund.
It is a classic populist approach. Whether it works or not depends on whether the supply actually increases. If you stop BlackRock from buying houses, but you still do not build any new ones, the price stays high because of the scarcity. That is why the executive orders from the president are actually more interesting to me. Deregulating the building process and streamlining the mortgage path for community banks hits the root of the supply problem. It acknowledges that the barrier is often bureaucratic.
The regulatory barriers are often where the family-sized units die. In many cities, the zoning requirements for a 3-bedroom unit are so much more onerous than for a studio. You might need more parking spaces, more green space, or different fire egress rules. A developer looks at the math and realizes they can make 30% more profit by just building 40 studios instead of 15 3-bedroom units. The market is literally incentivized to prevent families from existing in urban centers.
We actually touched on this a long time ago in episode 512 when we were discussing why Israel owns 93% of its land. The way a state manages its land and housing policy dictates every other social outcome. including how many babies are born. If you treat land as a speculative asset rather than a foundation for the next generation, you get exactly what we are seeing now.
And we saw the same thing with the daycare paradox in episode 1262. The timing of parenthood and the logistical challenges are all intertwined. If you postpone the house, you postpone the kid, and by the time you have the kid, you are older, your parents are older and less able to help with childcare, and the costs just compound. It is a massive structural failure. The biological window for help from grandparents is closing at the same time the financial window for homeownership is closing.
So, what are the practical takeaways for someone looking at this data in March 2026? First, if you are a policymaker, building more micro-units is not a solution to the fertility crisis. You need 3-bedroom inventory. Second, the bank of mom and dad is no longer an anomaly. It is a systemic component of the market. If you are planning for the future, you have to account for that intergenerational wealth transfer as a primary driver of prices.
And for the individual, you need to be aware of the 30-year trap. If you are approaching 40 and have not bought yet, you need to look very closely at your retirement timeline and how that will affect your creditworthiness. Banks are going to get stricter on this as the median buyer age continues to climb. We are likely to see more age-based discrimination in lending, even if it is couched in terms of risk management. You should monitor the 30-year trap as a leading indicator for future credit tightening.
It is a tough landscape. The postponement trend isn't just a lifestyle choice. It is a forced response to an environment that has made the traditional milestones of adulthood increasingly difficult to reach. We are seeing a complete rewriting of the human life cycle in real time. The question is whether we can adapt our financial and physical infrastructure fast enough to stop the fertility slide.
What I find most fascinating is the realization that we cannot solve the fertility problem without solving the 3-bedroom problem. Benjamin Couillard's research has basically given us the blueprint. If we want a future with a stable population, we have to build cities where a family of 4 can actually live without needing a multi-million-dollar inheritance. We need to stop building for the transient worker and start building for the permanent family.
It is a tall order, but at least the data is finally starting to point in the right direction. We are moving past the idea that this is just a cultural shift. It is an economic bottleneck, and the bottleneck is shaped like a 3-bedroom house. If the average age of homeownership continues to climb toward 50, we are going to have to rethink everything from Social Security to the very concept of a nuclear family.
It will be interesting to see if these new executive orders and the Senate bill actually move the needle by the end of the year. If we do not see a surge in family-sized housing starts, that record low fertility rate of 1.62 is going to stay record low or drop even further. The long-term impact of that kind of demographic winter is something we are only just beginning to model.
I think that is a good place to leave it for today. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It is a heavy topic, but one that is absolutely central to where we are headed as a society.
Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We could not do these deep dives without their support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us reach more people who are interested in these kinds of deep dives.
We will be back next time with another prompt. Find all our past episodes and the full archive at myweirdprompts.com.
See you then.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow.